So, here's something you've probably never really stopped to think about. But once you do, it kind of changes the way you see everything around you. Right now, wherever you are, you're surrounded by stuff. That's not a profound statement on its own, I know, but stay with me for a second. The pillow under your head, the fabric of whatever you're wearing, the ceiling above you, the glass in your windows, the phone or speaker playing this. Every single one of those things is made of a material that somebody at some point had to figure out. Not just figure out how to shape it or build with it, but figure out what it actually is, why it behaves the way it does, why glass is transparent but steel isn't, why rubber stretches and ceramic doesn't, why copper conducts electricity and wood doesn't, why some things shatter and other things bend. These aren't obvious questions. For most of human history, nobody had good answers to any of them. People just knew, from trial and error over thousands of years, that certain stuff worked for certain jobs. And that practical knowledge was genuinely impressive, don't get me wrong. But the why behind it? That's materials science. And the story of how we went from banging rocks together to engineering materials atom by atom is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in all of human civilization. Let's start where it actually started, which is a long, long time ago. And I mean really long. The oldest known stone tools date back roughly 3.5 million years, found in places like Lomekwi in Kenya. 3.5 million years. That predates our own species by a wide margin. These were made by earlier hominins, probably Australopithecus or something close. And here's what's fascinating about that. Even at that impossibly early stage, there was already a kind of material selection happening. Not conscious, not scientific, but real. These early toolmakers weren't grabbing just any rock. They were choosing specific types of stone, ones that fractured in useful ways, that produced sharp edges when struck. They were, in the most primitive sense imaginable, doing materials science. They were selecting materials based on their mechanical properties. Now, fast forward a couple million years to the more refined stone tools of the Paleolithic, the hand axes, the blades, the scrapers. By this point, probably around 300,000 years ago, early humans had gotten remarkably good at working with stone, and the material of choice in many parts of the world was flint. And flint is genuinely interesting from a materials perspective. It's a form of microcrystalline quartz, silicon dioxide basically, but arranged in these incredibly tiny crystal grains packed tightly together. And the key property that made flint so valuable is something called conchoidal fracture. That's a term worth knowing. When you strike flint in the right way, it doesn't break along neat crystal planes the way something like mica would. Instead, it fractures in these smooth, curved, shell-like shapes. Conchoidal, from the Greek word for shell. And those curved fracture surfaces can be astonishingly sharp. Sharper than a surgical steel scalpel, actually. The edges of well-knapped flint can be just a few molecules thick. Think about what that means. Tens of thousands of years before anyone understood atoms or crystal structures or fracture mechanics, people had figured out, purely through practice and observation, how to exploit the microstructure of a material to produce edges sharper than almost anything we manufacture today. They didn't know why flint worked the way it did. They just knew it did. And they got extraordinarily skilled at controlling those fractures, striking at precise angles, using antler or bone hammers for finer work, applying pressure flaking to shape the final edge. It was craftsmanship of the highest order, and it was all built on an intuitive understanding of how a material responds to force. And here's the thing, that gap between practical knowledge and theoretical understanding, That gap is basically the entire story of materials science. For most of history, the practical knowledge came first, sometimes by thousands of years. People figured out what worked long before anyone could explain why it worked. And closing that gap, turning craft into science, is what transformed the world. So let's talk about the next big leap, which was metals. The transition from stone to metal is one of the most important technological shifts in human history, and it didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages, over thousands of years, and it happened differently in different parts of the world. The first metal that humans used was almost certainly copper, and the earliest evidence of copper working goes back to around 9,000 years ago, in places like Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and parts of the Middle East. And the first copper that people used wasn't smelted. It was native copper. Pure metallic copper that occurs naturally in certain geological formations. You can find it just sitting there in rocks, these nuggets and veins of reddish metal. And early people figured out that you could hammer it into shape. You could pound it into beads, into small tools, into decorative objects. But here's where it gets interesting, because when you hammer copper, something happens that those early metal workers would have noticed even if they couldn't explain it. It gets harder. The more you work it, the more you hammer and bend and shape it, the harder and stiffer it becomes. And eventually, if you keep hammering, it gets brittle and starts to crack. This phenomenon has a name: work hardening or strain hardening, and it's one of the most fundamental concepts in material science. To understand why it happens, you need to know a little bit about what's going on inside a metal at the atomic level, and we'll get deeper into that later. But here's the basic idea. Metals are crystalline. Their atoms are arranged in regular, repeating three-dimensional patterns, lattices, we call them. And in a perfect crystal, every atom would be exactly where it's supposed to be, in perfect geometric order. But real crystals are never perfect. They're full of defects, places where the pattern is disrupted. One of the most important types of defect is called a dislocation. Imagine a half plane of atoms that just sort of ends in the middle of the crystal, like an extra card slipped partway into a deck. That edge where the extra plane ends, that's a dislocation. And here's the crucial thing. When you apply stress to a metal, it deforms, it changes shape, primarily because these dislocations move through the crystal lattice. They glide along specific planes, and as they move, they allow layers of atoms to slide past each other. That's what makes metals ductile. That's why you can hammer copper into a new shape instead of it just shattering like stone. But, and this is the key, as you keep deforming the metal, you generate more and more dislocations. And dislocations interact with each other. They get tangled up. They pile up at obstacles. They block each other's movement. And as the dislocation density increases, it becomes harder and harder for any individual dislocation to move. The metal resists further deformation. It gets harder. It gets stronger. Work hardening. Now, those early copper workers didn't know any of this. They had no concept of atoms, let alone dislocations. But they discovered something remarkable through pure experimentation. If you take your work-hardened copper, the stuff that's gotten brittle and difficult, and you heat it up in a fire, it becomes soft again. You can work it some more. This process, heating a metal to restore its softness and ductility, is called annealing, and it's been practiced for at least 8,000 years. What's actually happening during annealing is that the thermal energy allows the atoms to rearrange themselves. New defect-free crystal grains nucleate and grow, replacing the heavily deformed dislocation-tangled grains. The technical term is recrystallization. The metal essentially heals itself, rebuilding its crystal structure from scratch. And just like that, it's soft and workable again. Think about how powerful that discovery was. With stone, what you had was what you got. You could shape it by removing material, by chipping and flaking, but you couldn't fundamentally change its properties. With copper, you could. You could make it harder by working it. You could make it soft again by heating it. You could cycle back and forth, shaping it incrementally, controlling its properties through processing. That's a completely different relationship with a material. That's not just using what nature gives you. That's manipulating a material's internal structure to get the properties you want. That's the seed of everything that comes later. The next enormous leap was smelting, figuring out how to extract metal from ore. Native copper is relatively rare, but copper ore, minerals like malachite, that beautiful green stone, which is copper carbonate, is much more common. And at some point, probably around 5000 BCE, give or take, someone discovered that if you heat malachite in a charcoal fire, the carbon in the charcoal reacts with the oxygen in the copper carbonate, and pure copper metal separates out. This is a chemical reduction reaction. The carbon strips the oxygen away from the copper, producing carbon dioxide gas and leaving behind liquid metal. And this was revolutionary, because suddenly, you weren't limited to finding naturally occurring metal. You could create it. You could transform one substance into another using fire and chemistry. And the temperatures required, around 1100 degrees Celsius for proper copper smelting, meant that this wasn't something that happened by accident around a campfire. You needed purpose-built furnaces, forced air from bellows, specific types of fuel. You needed technology and skill and accumulated knowledge. And once people had copper smelting, something else became possible, something that would change the trajectory of civilization. Because copper, for all its usefulness, has a problem. It's soft. Even work-hardened copper isn't great for tools that need to hold a sharp edge or withstand heavy impact. It's fine for jewelry and small implements, but for serious tools and weapons, you want something harder. And here's where one of the most important discoveries in all of material science enters the picture. And it's the discovery that when you mix metals together, when you alloy them, you can get properties that neither metal has on its own. The alloy that changed everything was bronze. Bronze is primarily copper mixed with tin, typically around 10 to 12% tin by weight, and bronze is dramatically harder and stronger than pure copper. It holds an edge better. It casts better. It flows more smoothly when molten and shrinks less when it solidifies, which means you can cast more intricate shapes. The Bronze Age, which began around 3300 BCE in the Near East, wasn't just a change in what people made things from. It was a change in what was possible. Bronze weapons and tools were simply better than anything that came before, and the civilizations that mastered bronze production gained enormous advantages. But why is bronze harder than copper? What does adding tin actually do? This is where it starts to get really satisfying, because the answer connects directly back to those dislocations we talked about. Remember, metals deform because dislocations move through the crystal lattice. Anything that impedes dislocation motion makes the metal harder and stronger. And when you dissolve tin atoms into a copper crystal lattice, the tin atoms are a different size than the copper atoms. tin atoms are bigger. So wherever a tin atom sits in the lattice, it distorts the surrounding crystal structure. It creates a local strain field. And when a dislocation tries to glide past that tin atom, it has to fight through that strain field. The tin atoms act as obstacles, pinning the dislocations, making it harder for them to move. This is called solid solution strengthening, and it's one of the most fundamental strengthening mechanisms in metallurgy. You're essentially putting roadblocks in the path of dislocation motion by introducing foreign atoms into the crystal. And the beautiful thing is, this same principle, impeding dislocation motion to increase strength, shows up again and again throughout the entire history of materials science, in different forms, in different materials, but always the same underlying logic. Work hardening does it by tangling dislocations with each other. Solid solution strengthening does it by introducing differently sized atoms. Later, people would discover other mechanisms: precipitation hardening, grain boundary strengthening. But they're all variations on the same theme. Make it harder for dislocations to move, and the material gets stronger. It's one of those ideas that, once you really grasp it, unlocks your understanding of almost everything about why metals behave the way they do. So here we are, somewhere around 3000 BCE, and humanity has already stumbled onto some of the deepest principles in materials science without having any theoretical framework to explain them. They know that working a metal makes it harder. They know that heating it makes it soft again. They know that mixing metals together can produce something better than either one alone. All of this knowledge is empirical, learned by doing, passed down through apprenticeship, refined over generations. And it would stay that way for a very, very long time. But there was another material revolution coming, one that would prove even more transformative than bronze, and it was already beginning to stir in scattered furnaces across the ancient world. Because some metal workers, pushing their furnaces to higher and higher temperatures, were starting to produce a different metal entirely, one that was more abundant, more versatile, and ultimately more important than anything that came before it. They were starting to make iron, and iron as a material is fascinating because in some ways it's a step backward before it becomes a giant leap forward. See, the earliest iron that people encountered wasn't even something they made. It fell from the sky. Meteoritic iron, chunks of nickel iron alloy that survived the fiery descent through the atmosphere and landed on the ground, had been collected and prized for thousands of years before anyone figured out how to extract iron from ore. There are iron beads found in Egyptian graves dating to around 3200 BCE, and when scientists analyzed them, the nickel content gave it away. These came from meteorites. The Egyptians even had a word for it that roughly translates to iron from the sky. And if you think about it, that's kind of poetic. The first iron humans ever worked with literally came from space. But meteoritic iron was rare, obviously. You couldn't build a civilization on it. The real challenge was getting iron out of the ground, out of its ores. And this is where things get tricky compared to copper and bronze. Iron ore is incredibly abundant. It's one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust. You practically trip over it. But here's the problem. Iron has a much higher melting point than copper. Copper melts at around 1085 degrees Celsius. Iron doesn't melt until you hit about 1538 degrees. And those early furnaces? They couldn't get anywhere close to 1538 degrees. Not even close. So for the longest time, even though people knew iron ore existed, even though they could see iron in meteorites and knew it was useful, they simply couldn't produce it the way they produced copper, by melting it down and pouring it into molds. So what did they do instead? They invented something called a bloomery. And this is a really clever piece of ancient engineering. A bloomery is essentially a small furnace, usually built from clay, where you layer iron ore and charcoal together and then force air through the bottom using bellows. The charcoal burns, producing carbon monoxide, and that carbon monoxide does the chemical heavy lifting. It strips the oxygen away from the iron oxide in the ore, reducing it to metallic iron. Same basic chemistry as copper smelting, just harder. The thing is, because the bloomery can't reach iron's melting point, you don't get a nice pool of liquid iron at the bottom. Instead, what you get is this spongy, porous lump called a bloom. It's a messy mixture of iron and slag being the glassy waste material from the impurities in the ore. And this bloom, fresh out of the furnace, is honestly kind of terrible. It's full of holes, full of trapped slag, and it's not very strong at all. But here's where the smith's skill comes in. You take that bloom while it's still hot, and you hammer it. Again and again. You fold it, you hammer it flat, you fold it again. Each time you hammer, you're squeezing out trapped slag, closing up pores, and consolidating the iron into a denser, more uniform piece. This process is incredibly labor-intensive. It might take hours of hammering at the anvil to turn a single bloom into usable wrought iron. And wrought iron, that's what this product is called, is actually a pretty decent material. It's tough, it's malleable, it's relatively easy to shape by forging. The word wrought just means worked, as in, it's been shaped by working it with a hammer. And wrought iron served humanity well for centuries. You can make tools from it, nails, chains, gates, all sorts of things. But here's the thing about pure iron, or nearly pure iron like wrought iron. It's actually not that hard. It's softer than bronze in many cases, so early iron tools and weapons weren't necessarily better than their bronze counterparts. In fact, some of the earliest iron swords were arguably worse than good bronze ones. They bent more easily, they didn't hold an edge as well. So why did iron eventually win? Why did the Bronze Age give way to the Iron Age, which historians typically date to around 1200 BCE in the Mediterranean world? A few reasons. First, availability. Tin, which you need for bronze, is actually quite rare geographically. There are only a handful of significant tin deposits in the ancient world. Cornwall in Britain, parts of Iberia, some deposits in Central Asia. If you lived in the Eastern Mediterranean, you were dependent on long-distance trade networks to get your tin. And around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened: the Late Bronze Age collapse. This was one of the most dramatic civilizational disruptions in human history. Within a few decades, nearly every major Bronze Age civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed or was severely weakened. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece crumbled. Egypt barely survived. The great trading cities of the Levant were destroyed. The exact causes are still debated: drought, famine, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, internal rebellions, earthquakes, probably some combination of all of these. But whatever the causes, the effect on metallurgy was clear. The tin trade networks broke down, and without tin, you can't make bronze. Iron ore, on the other hand, was everywhere. You didn't need a far-flung trade network to get it. Any community with access to iron ore deposits and enough wood for charcoal could, in principle, produce their own iron. So iron became the democratic metal, the material of necessity in a world where the old supply chains had collapsed. And this is a pattern you see throughout materials science history. Sometimes a material wins not because it's technically superior in every way, but because of economics, availability, or geopolitical circumstances. The best material in the world doesn't matter if you can't get your hands on it. But the second reason iron won is more interesting from a materials science perspective, and it brings us to one of the most important discoveries in all of metallurgy: steel. Because somewhere along the way, ancient smiths figured out that if you heated iron in contact with carbon, specifically if you kept it in a charcoal fire for long enough at high enough temperatures, the surface of the iron would absorb carbon atoms, and the resulting material was dramatically harder than regular iron. This process is called carburization, or case hardening, and it's been practiced for at least 3,000 years. Now think about what's happening at the atomic level, because this connects beautifully to everything we talked about earlier with bronze. In bronze, you have tin atoms sitting in the copper crystal lattice, acting as obstacles to dislocation motion. In carburized iron, you have carbon atoms doing something similar, but with a twist. Carbon atoms are tiny compared to iron atoms, really tiny. So instead of substituting for iron atoms in the lattice, the way tin substitutes for copper, carbon atoms squeeze into the gaps between iron atoms. These gaps are called interstitial sites, and this type of strengthening is called interstitial solid solution strengthening. It's the same fundamental principle: foreign atoms impeding dislocation motion, but the geometry is different. The carbon atoms sitting in those interstitial sites create local strain fields in the lattice, and those strain fields interact with dislocations, making them harder to move. More carbon means more obstacles, means harder material. Up to a point, anyway. And this is essentially what steel is. Steel is iron with a controlled amount of carbon dissolved in it, typically somewhere between about 0.2 and 2.1% carbon by weight. That might sound like almost nothing, less than 2%, but the effect on properties is enormous. A piece of wrought iron with almost no carbon is soft and ductile. Add just 0.5% carbon, and you've got medium carbon steel that's significantly stronger and harder. Push it up toward 1%, and you've got high carbon steel that can hold a razor edge. It's one of the most dramatic examples in all of materials science of how a tiny compositional change can transform a material's behavior. But here's what's really wild, and this is where the story gets even more interesting. Carbon doesn't just strengthen iron through simple interstitial solid solution strengthening. If you heat steel up to high temperatures and then cool it very quickly, say, by plunging a red-hot blade into water or oil, something remarkable happens inside the crystal structure. At high temperatures, iron atoms arrange themselves in what's called a face-centered cubic structure, also known as austenite, and in this structure there's actually a fair amount of room for carbon atoms to sit comfortably in those interstitial sites. But at lower temperatures, iron wants to be in a body-centered cubic structure, which has much smaller interstitial spaces. If you cool the steel slowly, the carbon atoms have time to diffuse out and form separate particles of iron carbide, a compound called cementite. The result is a relatively soft, layered microstructure called pearlite, because under a microscope it has a pearly, iridescent appearance. But if you cool it fast, really fast, the carbon atoms get trapped. They don't have time to diffuse out. The iron lattice is trying to transform from face-centered cubic to body-centered cubic. But all that trapped carbon distorts the structure, forcing it into a strained, stretched configuration called body-centered tetragonal. And this new structure, this carbon supersaturated, highly strained crystal structure, is called martensite, named after the German metallurgist Adolf Martens, who first described it in the 1890s, though of course the phenomenon itself had been exploited by swordsmiths for millennia before anyone understood the science. Martensite is extraordinarily hard. It's also extremely brittle, so brittle that a fully martensitic blade might shatter like glass if you struck it against something hard. So ancient smiths learned to temper their blades after quenching. Tempering means reheating the hardened steel to a moderate temperature, not hot enough to undo the martensite entirely, but hot enough to allow some of the internal stresses to relax and some of the carbon to begin diffusing into tiny carbide particles. This trades a little bit of hardness for a significant gain in toughness. And the exact tempering temperature matters enormously. Heat it to around 200 degrees Celsius, and you get a very hard blade that's still somewhat brittle, good for razors or chisels. Heat it to 300 or 400 degrees, and you get something tougher, but less hard, better for swords or springs. Ancient smiths learned to judge the temperature by the color of the oxide film that forms on the steel's surface during tempering. A pale straw color means around 220 degrees. A deeper brown means around 260. Blue means around 300. Purple is somewhere in between. They were reading a thermometer they didn't know they had, using the physics of thin film interference, the same phenomenon that creates rainbow colors in soap bubbles, to control a heat treatment process whose underlying science wouldn't be understood for another 2,000 years. Think about that for a second. A medieval swordsmith, watching the colors creep along a blade held over coals, adjusting the heat with the intuition born of years of practice, was manipulating crystal structures at the atomic level. They were controlling phase transformations, managing carbon diffusion, balancing hardness against toughness, all without knowing a single one of those words. The knowledge was entirely empirical, entirely embodied in skilled hands and trained eyes, passed from master to apprentice across generations. And it worked. It worked beautifully. This gap between practice and theory, between knowing how and knowing why, is one of the great recurring themes in materials science, and it persisted for an astonishingly long time. Even as late as the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform the world, the people making iron and steel were still working largely by feel, by tradition, by rules of thumb that had been refined over centuries but never explained. And the Industrial Revolution itself would both depend on and drive forward the understanding of materials in ways that nobody could have predicted, because suddenly the demands on materials changed completely. Suddenly, you needed iron, not just for swords and plowshares, but for machines, for engines, for rails, for structures of a scale and ambition that the ancient world could never have imagined. And the first material that the Industrial Revolution would push to its absolute limits, and sometimes beyond, was cast iron. Because while wrought iron was made in bloomeries by keeping temperatures below iron's melting point, there was another approach that had been developing in parallel, one that involved getting furnaces hot enough to actually melt iron completely. And that changes everything about what you can do with the material. See, when you melt iron fully, you can pour it into molds. You can cast it into shapes, complex shapes, intricate shapes, shapes that would take a blacksmith days or weeks to hammer out. But here's the catch. To get iron to melt, you need to get it above 1,538 degrees Celsius. And the bloomery furnaces of the ancient world just couldn't do that. What could, though, was a taller, more powerful furnace design that had been evolving in China since at least the 5th century BCE, and in Europe from around the 12th or 13th century. The blast furnace. And the key innovation was right there, in the name. Blast. Forced air, pushed into the furnace through bellows, or later through water-powered mechanisms, dramatically increasing the combustion temperature. More air means more oxygen reacting with the charcoal fuel, which means more heat, which means you can finally cross that threshold and get iron to flow like water. But here's what's really interesting about the chemistry. When iron melts in a blast furnace surrounded by all that carbon from the charcoal fuel, it absorbs a lot of carbon. Way more than the small amounts you'd get from carburizing wrought iron. We're talking about carbon content up in the range of 2 to 4%, sometimes even higher. And that changes the material fundamentally. This is cast iron. It's hard, it's brittle, and it behaves completely differently from wrought iron or steel. Now, you might remember that steel has carbon content roughly between about 0.2% and 2%. Cast iron goes above that, and the reason that matters comes back to what's happening at the atomic level. At those higher carbon concentrations, the carbon can't all stay dissolved in the iron crystal structure. There's just too much of it. So it forms a separate phase. In the most common type of cast iron, called gray cast iron, the excess carbon precipitates out as flakes of graphite. Actual graphite, the same stuff in pencil lead, sitting there as tiny flakes distributed throughout the iron matrix. And those graphite flakes act as stress concentrators. Imagine a sheet of paper with a bunch of tiny cuts scattered through it. Each one is a weak point where a crack can start. That's essentially what those graphite flakes do. They make cast iron strong in compression. You can stack enormous weight on it, and it holds up beautifully, but weak in tension. Pull on it, bend it, shock it, and it can crack suddenly, almost without warning. It doesn't stretch or deform the way wrought iron does. It just snaps. And this matters enormously for how people used it. Cast iron was fantastic for things that mostly experienced compressive loads: columns, building frames, cannon barrels, cooking pots, stove plates, decorative railings. You could pour it into a mold and get a finished product with relatively little additional work. That made it cheap. That made it fast. And in the early Industrial Revolution, cheap and fast were exactly what people wanted. The Chinese, by the way, had figured this out centuries before Europe. By the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, Chinese foundries were producing cast iron on an industrial scale. Plowshares, cooking vessels, even sections of the Great Wall's infrastructure. They'd also developed techniques for decarburizing cast iron, essentially burning off some of the excess carbon to produce something closer to steel. This was sophisticated metallurgy happening 2,000 years ago, and it's one of those historical facts that should make you pause and reconsider any simple narrative about technological progress being a straight line from east to west. But in Europe, the blast furnace really came into its own from the 14th and 15th centuries onward, and by the time the Industrial Revolution kicked off in Britain in the mid-1700s, cast iron was the material of the moment, and the person whose name is most associated with that transformation. Well, there are several, but let's talk about Abraham Darby. The first Abraham Darby, because there were 3 generations of them, all named Abraham, all iron masters, which can get confusing but is also kind of wonderful. Abraham Darby I was a Quaker businessman working in Coalbrookdale, in Shropshire, England. And in 1709, he successfully smelted iron using coke instead of charcoal. Now, this might not sound like a big deal, but it was enormous. Charcoal comes from wood, and by the early 1700s, Britain was running out of forests. Centuries of shipbuilding, construction, and iron smelting had stripped the landscape. Coke, on the other hand, comes from coal, and Britain had coal in abundance. Darby figured out that if you heated coal in the absence of air, driving off the volatile compounds and the sulfur, you got coke, which burned hotter and cleaner than raw coal and could serve as the fuel and reducing agent in a blast furnace. It wasn't a perfect substitute right away. The early coke-smelted iron had quality issues, and it took decades of refinement by Darby and his descendants. But it broke the bottleneck. Iron production was no longer limited by how many trees you could cut down. It was limited by how much coal you could dig up. And in Britain, that was practically unlimited. Abraham Darby III, the grandson, gave the world one of the most iconic structures in engineering history. In 1779, the iron bridge was completed across the River Severn at Coalbrookdale, the first major bridge in the world built entirely of cast iron. It's still standing, by the way. You can go visit it. It spans about 30 meters, and it's a single arch. And if you look at it closely, you notice something charming and telling about the state of engineering knowledge at the time. The joints and connections are designed the way a carpenter would design them: mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, wedges. The builders were thinking in wood. They took the shapes and techniques they knew from timber construction and translated them into iron, because nobody had yet developed a design language specific to metal structures. It works. The bridge has stood for nearly 250 years, but it's over-engineered in some places and under-engineered in others, and it uses about 378 tons of iron, which is far more than a modern engineer would need for the same span. And this is a beautiful example of something that happens again and again in materials science and engineering. When a new material arrives, people first use it the way they used the old material. They think in the old shapes, the old forms. It takes time, sometimes generations, before designers learn to think in the new material's own language, to exploit its unique strengths and work around its specific weaknesses. But cast iron's weaknesses would soon become painfully, tragically clear, because people started using it for things it was never suited for. Remember, strong in compression, weak in tension, brittle under shock loads. As long as you respected those limitations, cast iron served beautifully. But the 19th century was not an era known for respecting limitations. It was an era of ambition, of expansion, of railways stretching across continents, and railways needed bridges. The Dee Bridge disaster of 1847 is one of the earliest and most instructive examples. Robert Stephenson, son of George Stephenson, the famous railway pioneer, designed a bridge across the River Dee in Chester, using cast iron girders reinforced with wrought iron tie bars. On May 24, 1847, a train was crossing the bridge when one of the cast iron girders fractured and the bridge collapsed. 5 people were killed. The investigation that followed revealed that the cast iron girders had failed in a way that was almost inevitable given the design. They were being subjected to bending loads, which meant the bottom face of each girder was in tension. And cast iron, with those graphite flakes acting as internal crack initiators, simply couldn't handle sustained tensile stress reliably. The wrought iron reinforcements that Stephenson had added weren't sufficient to compensate. What made this disaster particularly significant was the public inquiry that followed. It forced engineers and the British government to confront a difficult truth. Cast iron was not suitable for bridge beams. It could handle columns and arches where the loads were compressive, but not beams and girders where bending created tension. This seems obvious in hindsight, but at the time, the understanding of how materials behaved under different loading conditions was still rudimentary. Engineers were building on experience and intuition, and the experience with cast iron in compression was so positive that many assumed it would perform equally well in other situations. The D Bridge collapse didn't end the use of cast iron in structures overnight. Change in engineering practice is always slower than it should be, but it accelerated the shift toward wrought iron and eventually steel for structural applications where tensile strength mattered, and it contributed to a growing recognition that material selection couldn't be based on tradition or convenience alone. You had to understand the specific mechanical properties of your material and match them to the specific loading conditions of your structure. This is a principle that sounds almost painfully obvious when you state it plainly, but it's one that the engineering profession learned through failure after failure, each one written in human lives. And it connects back to that fundamental idea we keep returning to, that the behavior of a material comes down to what's happening at the microscopic and atomic level. Those graphite flakes in cast iron aren't visible to the naked eye. You can't see them when you look at a cast iron girder, but they're there, and they determine everything about how that girder will behave when you load it. So by the middle of the 19th century, there was a pressing need for a material that combined the best qualities of wrought iron and cast iron, something you could produce in large quantities, something that was strong in both tension and compression, something tough enough to absorb shocks without shattering, something you could shape and form and build with on an industrial scale. What people needed, in other words, was steel. Good steel, lots of it. And the problem was that steel in the 1850s was still essentially a craft product made in small batches by skilled workers using techniques that hadn't changed all that much since the days of Damascus blades and samurai swords. A ton of steel cost roughly 40 to 50 times more than a ton of cast iron. You could make a knife from steel, a sword, a spring, a tool. But you couldn't build a railway or a bridge or a building from it. The quantities were too small and the cost was too high. And then, in 1856, a man named Henry Bessemer stood up before the British Association for the Advancement of Science and described a process that would change the world. And the story of how he got there and what happened afterward is one of the most dramatic tales in all of engineering history because it involves a genuine flash of insight, a spectacular public failure, a bitter patent dispute, and an eventual triumph that would reshape civilization. Bessemer wasn't even a metallurgist by training. He was an inventor, a tinkerer, a man who'd made his money from things like a machine for stamping gold paint and a method for manufacturing pencils. And the reason he turned his attention to steel in the first place had nothing to do with bridges or railways. It had to do with guns. Specifically, it had to do with a new kind of artillery shell he'd invented during the Crimean War. Bessemer had designed a spinning projectile, an elongated shell with internal grooves that would cause it to rotate in flight, making it far more accurate than the round cannonballs that armies had been lobbing at each other for centuries. It was a genuinely clever idea, and the French military was interested. But here was the problem. The shell was heavier than a traditional cannonball, and when they tested it in conventional cast iron cannons, the guns couldn't handle the pressure. They cracked. They burst. Cast iron, as we've already talked about, is brittle. It's strong when you squeeze it, but it can't handle the sudden, explosive tensile forces that happen when a charge goes off inside a gun barrel. The barrels were literally blowing apart. So Bessemer found himself in a strange position. He had a brilliant new projectile, but no gun strong enough to fire it. And that's what sent him down the rabbit hole of steelmaking. He needed stronger gun barrels, He needed steel. And since nobody could make steel cheaply enough or in large enough quantities to cast entire cannon barrels, he decided he'd figure out how to do it himself, which is an incredibly audacious thing to decide when you think about it. This is a man with no formal training in metallurgy, no background in ironworking, essentially saying, I'll just go ahead and solve a problem that has stumped metalworkers for 3,000 years. But that's exactly what he did. And here's the thing about Bessemer. His lack of formal training might actually have been an advantage. He didn't know what was supposed to be impossible. He didn't carry the weight of conventional wisdom about how iron and steel behaved. He just thought about the problem from first principles and asked a very simple question. If steel is just iron with a small amount of carbon in it, and cast iron is iron with too much carbon in it, then why can't you just burn the extra carbon out of cast iron to turn it into steel? Now, this wasn't an entirely new idea. People had been decarburizing cast iron in various ways for centuries. The Chinese had done it, as we talked about, and the puddling process for making wrought iron was essentially about stirring molten iron to expose it to air and burn off the carbon. But all of those processes were slow, labor-intensive, and hard to control. Bessemer's insight was about speed and scale. What if, instead of slowly exposing the surface of the iron to air, you blasted cold air directly through the molten metal? Forced air, pushed right through the liquid iron from below, so that every bit of the melt was in contact with oxygen simultaneously. The carbon would burn off in minutes instead of hours, and the heat generated by the carbon combustion, because carbon burning in oxygen is an exothermic reaction, it releases energy. That heat would actually keep the metal molten, maybe even raise its temperature, so you wouldn't need to add extra fuel. Think about what that means. You're not just removing carbon. You're generating your own heat in the process. The reaction sustains itself. It's almost like the impurities in the iron are their own fuel source. That's elegant. That's the kind of idea that makes you sit up and say, wait, could that actually work? Bessemer built a small experimental converter. Basically, a pear-shaped vessel lined with refractory material, with holes in the bottom called tuyères, through which air could be blasted upward into the molten iron. He poured in a charge of molten cast iron, turned on the air blast, and what happened next was, by all accounts, absolutely terrifying. The reaction was violent. Sparks and flame erupted from the top of the converter. The temperature inside soared. The whole thing looked like it was about to explode. His workers ran for cover, but Bessemer stood his ground, watching, and after about 15 or 20 minutes, the fireworks died down. The carbon had burned off, and when he poured out the metal and tested it, it was steel, real steel, made in minutes, not days, without fuel, without crucibles, without skilled puddlers stirring a furnace for hours, just air and molten iron and chemistry. He presented his results to the British Association in August of 1856 in a paper with one of the great titles in engineering history, The Manufacture of Malleable Iron and Steel Without Fuel. And the reaction was electric. The audience understood immediately what this could mean. Cheap steel, unlimited steel. Steel for railways, for bridges, for buildings, for ships, for everything. The iron masters in the audience were falling over themselves to license the process. Within weeks, Bessemer had sold licenses worth tens of thousands of pounds. It was a triumph. And then everything fell apart. Because when those iron masters went home and tried the Bessemer process with their own iron, it didn't work. The steel they produced was terrible. It was brittle. It was full of cracks. It was worse than ordinary wrought iron. They poured money into converters and got nothing but scrap metal. They were furious. They accused Bessemer of fraud. Some demanded their money back. His reputation, which had soared overnight, crashed just as fast. For a while, it looked like the whole thing was a spectacular, embarrassing failure. So what went wrong? Here's where the materials science gets really interesting, and it connects back to everything we've been building up about how tiny amounts of the right or wrong elements can completely change a metal's behavior. The problem was phosphorus. Bessemer had done his experiments with iron from certain sources, Welsh iron specifically, that happened to be very low in phosphorus. He didn't know that mattered because he didn't fully understand the chemistry. But the iron masters who licensed his process were using iron from other regions, iron that contained significant amounts of phosphorus. And phosphorus in steel is devastating. Even a fraction of a percent of phosphorus makes steel brittle. It segregates to the grain boundaries, those interfaces between individual crystals in the metal's microstructure, and it weakens the bonds between grains. When you stress the metal, instead of deforming plastically, absorbing energy, the grain boundaries just come apart. The metal fractures along those weakened boundaries in a failure mode called intergranular fracture. It's one of the sneakiest failure mechanisms in metallurgy, because the individual grains might be perfectly fine. It's only the boundaries between them that are compromised. And here's the kicker. Bessemer's air blast process couldn't remove phosphorus. The oxygen in the air would react with carbon, with silicon, with manganese, burning those elements out of the iron. But phosphorus, under those conditions, stayed right where it was. So if your starting iron was clean, you got clean steel. If your starting iron had phosphorus in it, you got brittle, useless metal. Bessemer hadn't discovered a universal steel-making process. He'd discovered a process that only worked with specific low-phosphorus ores, and he hadn't realized it. Now, this could have been the end of the story. But Bessemer was nothing if not persistent. He spent years refining the process, figuring out the chemistry, learning, often the hard way, about the role of different elements. And he wasn't alone. A Swedish ironmaster named Göran Fredrik Göransson actually got the process to work reliably before Bessemer did, using Sweden's exceptionally pure iron ores. And then there was Robert Mouchet, a metallurgist from the Forest of Dean, who made a crucial contribution that Bessemer was, shall we say, not always eager to acknowledge. Mouchet figured out that you could add a precise amount of a manganese-iron alloy called Spiegeleisen back into the steel after the blow was complete. The manganese served two purposes. It combined with any remaining oxygen dissolved in the steel, preventing blowholes, those little gas bubbles that would otherwise make the metal porous. And it also combined with sulfur, another harmful impurity, neutralizing it. This was a critical fix. Without Mouchet's addition of Spiegeleisen, the Bessemer process produced steel that was full of dissolved oxygen and prone to cracking. With it, you got sound, workable metal. The patent dispute between Bessemer and Mouchet is one of those sad, familiar stories in engineering history. Mouchet held a patent on the Spiegeleisen addition, but he let it lapse, possibly through a clerical error, possibly because he couldn't afford the renewal fees. Bessemer went on to use the technique freely and became enormously wealthy. Mouchet spent years in relative obscurity, bitter about what he saw as a stolen contribution. Eventually, Bessemer did grant Mouchet an annual pension of £300, which was something, but it was a far cry from the fortune that the process generated. It's a reminder that in the history of technology, the person who gets the credit isn't always the person who solved the hardest problem. But anyway, By the early 1860s, the Bessemer process was working, and the effect on the price of steel was staggering. Remember, in the 1850s, steel cost 40 to 50 times more than cast iron. By the 1870s, the price had dropped by roughly 80 to 90%. Steel went from a precious material to a commodity. And that single economic shift is one of the most consequential events in modern history, because it unlocked everything. Steel rails replaced iron rails on the world's railways, and because steel is so much stronger and more durable, trains could be heavier, faster, and more frequent. Steel beams made skyscrapers possible. You simply cannot build a 40-story building with cast iron or wrought iron. The columns would have to be impossibly thick. Steel wire made suspension bridges possible at scales that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Steel plate made modern warships possible, which reshaped naval warfare and, by extension, global politics. But the phosphorus problem hadn't gone away. It had just been sidestepped. The Bessemer process still required low phosphorus ore, and not every country had access to that. Britain had some, Sweden had excellent ore, but huge deposits of iron ore across Europe, in places like Lorraine and Luxembourg, across much of England, were high in phosphorus and therefore useless for Bessemer steelmaking. Think about what that means economically and geopolitically. Entire regions sitting on vast mineral wealth they couldn't fully exploit because of a chemistry problem. And that's where Sidney Gilchrist Thomas enters the picture. And if Bessemer's story is dramatic, Thomas's story is downright heartbreaking, because here was a man who solved one of the great remaining problems in industrial chemistry, changed the economic map of Europe, and then died before he could enjoy any of it. Thomas wasn't a professional metallurgist or an industrialist. He was a clerk at a London police court, a junior civil servant who studied chemistry in his spare time at evening classes. And somewhere around 1875, he learned about the phosphorus problem in steelmaking and became obsessed with solving it. He was 25 years old. The key insight Thomas had was about the lining of the converter. Bessemer's original converter used an acidic lining made of silica-based refractory materials. And in basic chemistry terms, phosphorus oxide is an acidic compound. An acidic slag sitting against an acidic lining won't react. They're chemically compatible, which means the phosphorus just stays in the metal. But if you line the converter with a basic material, something like calcined dolomite or magnesite, rich in calcium and magnesium, then the basic lining would react with the acidic phosphorus oxide, pulling it out of the metal and locking it into the slag. It's acid-base chemistry, the kind of thing you might remember from school, but applied at 1500 degrees inside a vessel full of molten iron. Thomas worked on this idea for years, mostly in his spare time, with the help of his cousin Percy Gilchrist, who was a chemist at an ironworks in Wales. They experimented, they failed, they tried different lining compositions, they refined their slag chemistry. And in 1878, Thomas presented his results to the Iron and Steel Institute. The basic lining worked. Phosphorus levels in the finished steel dropped dramatically. Suddenly, all that high phosphorus ore that had been considered second-rate was viable. The Thomas process, as it became known, opened up the iron fields of Lorraine and Luxembourg and transformed the industrial geography of Europe. Germany, which had enormous reserves of phosphoric iron ore, became a steel superpower almost overnight. Some historians have argued that the Thomas process was one of the enabling factors behind Germany's rapid industrialization in the late 19th century, which in turn shaped the political tensions that would eventually lead to some of the most devastating conflicts the world has ever seen. And that's not an exaggeration. The steel output of a nation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was essentially a proxy for military power. If you could make more steel, you could build more warships, more artillery, more railway lines to move troops and supplies, and Germany's steel production, fueled in large part by those newly accessible phosphoric ores, surged past Britain's by the early 1900s. Think about that. Britain, the country that had started the whole Industrial Revolution, the country where Bessemer and Mouchet and Thomas had all done their work, overtaken in steel output by Germany within a few decades. The Thomas process didn't cause the First World War, obviously. History is never that simple. But it changed the balance of industrial power in Europe in ways that mattered enormously when the shooting started. And here's something poignant about Sidney Gilchrist Thomas himself. He didn't live to see any of that. He died in 1885 at the age of 34 from tuberculosis. He'd been in poor health for years. Some accounts suggest the strain of his research work alongside his demanding day job had weakened him. He made some money from his patents, and he left much of it to charitable causes, including support for workers' education. His cousin Percy Gilchrist lived much longer and spent years trying to ensure Thomas got proper credit for the basic process. But in the grand sweep of popular history, Thomas remains one of those figures who changed the world and then quietly vanished from the story. You've probably never heard his name before tonight. Most people haven't. But every time you look at a piece of structural steel, there's a decent chance the process that made it possible traces back, in one way or another, to that young clerk studying chemistry by candlelight after long days in a London police court. So by the 1880s and 1890s, we're living in a world that can produce steel cheaply and in enormous quantities from almost any iron ore. And that changes everything about what engineers can build. But here's the thing, and this is where materials science takes another fascinating turn. Just being able to make a lot of steel doesn't mean you understand steel. Not really. Not at the level you need to in order to predict how it will behave under every condition. And some of the most important lessons about steel's behavior came not from laboratories, but from disasters. Let's talk about something that happens to steel when it gets cold. Really cold. Because this is one of those material behaviors that nobody fully appreciated until it killed people. You might think of steel as tough, and it is. At room temperature, mild steel is wonderfully ductile. You can bend it, stretch it, and it absorbs a lot of energy before it fractures. That's what makes it such a great structural material. But cool that same steel down, take it below a certain temperature, and something changes. It becomes brittle, not gradually, not smoothly, but with a kind of sudden transition. Engineers call it the ductile to brittle transition, and it's one of the most important concepts in structural materials science. Here's what's happening at the atomic level. Steel, the kind we've been talking about, carbon steel with a body-centered cubic crystal structure, has a quirk. At higher temperatures, dislocations can move relatively freely through the lattice. The metal can deform plastically, absorb energy, give you warning before it fails. But as the temperature drops, the thermal energy available to help dislocations move decreases. The atoms are vibrating less. And in a body-centered cubic structure specifically, the resistance to dislocation motion, what's called the Peierls-Nabarro stress, increases sharply at lower temperatures. The dislocations get stuck. They can't move fast enough to relieve stress concentrations. And when a crack starts to form, instead of the material yielding and blunting that crack tip, the crack just runs. Fast, catastrophically. The steel shatters like glass. Now, this isn't true of all metals. Aluminum, copper, gold, metals with a face-centered cubic crystal structure, they don't show this transition. They stay ductile, even at very low temperatures. That's one of the reasons aluminum alloys are used in cryogenic applications, in things like liquid natural gas tanks. But steel, ordinary carbon steel, has this hidden vulnerability. And for a long time, nobody really understood it. The most dramatic and well-documented example of this problem came during the Second World War, with the Liberty ships. And this story is worth spending some time on, because it's one of those moments where materials science leaps from the laboratory into the headlines. The Liberty ships were cargo vessels, built in enormous numbers by the United States to supply the Allied war effort. The scale of production was staggering. Over 2,700 of them were built between 1941 and 1945. They were designed to be simple and fast to construct. And here's what was revolutionary about them. They were welded, not riveted. Previous generations of ships had been built by riveting steel plates together, punching holes, inserting rivets, hammering them into place. It worked, but it was slow and labor-intensive. Welding was faster. You could train workers to weld in weeks rather than the months it took to train a skilled riveter. And a welded hull was lighter and more watertight than a riveted one. So welding seemed like a clear win. But there was a catch that nobody fully appreciated. In a riveted ship, the hull is made of individual plates connected at discrete points. If a crack forms in one plate, it runs to the edge of that plate and stops. It can't easily jump across a rivet line to the next plate. The riveted joints act as natural crack arresters. But in a welded hull, the entire structure is essentially one continuous piece of steel. A crack that starts anywhere can propagate everywhere. There's nothing to stop it. And that's exactly what happened. During the war, Liberty ships began cracking, not just small cracks. Some of them broke completely in half. The most famous case was the SS Schenectady, which fractured amidships while sitting calmly at its outfitting dock in Portland, Oregon, in January 1943. No storm, no torpedo, no collision. The ship just broke. The fracture ran almost entirely around the hull, and the two halves of the vessel were left resting on the bottom of the shallow dock, held together only by the bottom plating. It happened at night, in cold weather, and the sound of the fracture was reportedly heard for over a mile. Altogether, about 1,500 incidents of significant cracking were recorded in Liberty ships and similar welded vessels during the war. Around 250 were considered serious, and roughly a dozen ships were total losses. They broke in half or were damaged beyond economical repair. Some of these failures happened in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, where temperatures were well below the ductile to brittle transition temperature of the steel being used. So what went wrong? Several things, and this is where the story gets really instructive from a materials science perspective. First, the steel itself. To build ships that fast, you couldn't be picky about your steel. Much of it was produced to meet minimum specifications. It was adequate in terms of strength, but it had relatively high levels of carbon and other elements that raised the transition temperature, meaning the steel became brittle at temperatures that ships in the North Atlantic would routinely encounter. Second, the welding. Many of the welders were inexperienced. Some had been trained in just a few weeks, remember. Poor welds created stress concentrations, little notches and defects that acted as crack initiation sites. And in a welded structure with no crack arresters, that was a recipe for disaster. Third, and this is subtle but crucial, the design itself introduced stress concentrations. square hatch corners, abrupt changes in cross-section, places where the geometry of the structure created locally high stresses. In a ductile material at room temperature, those stress concentrations might not matter much. The material yields locally, redistributes the stress, and life goes on. But in a brittle material at low temperature, a stress concentration is exactly where a crack will nucleate and then run without stopping. The investigation of the Liberty ship failures was led by a remarkable figure named Constance Tipper, a crystallographer and metallurgist at Cambridge University. She was one of the first researchers to clearly demonstrate the ductile to brittle transition in ship plate steel and to connect it quantitatively to the failures. The Tipper test, a notched bar impact test designed to evaluate a steel's transition temperature, bears her name. And her work, along with that of other researchers like George Irwin at the Naval Research Laboratory, laid the groundwork for an entirely new field, fracture mechanics. Fracture mechanics is, at its heart, the science of cracks. Not just whether a material is strong or weak, but how it behaves when it already has a flaw. And here's the thing, every real structure has flaws. Every weld has tiny imperfections. Every piece of steel has microscopic inclusions, little particles of slag or oxide trapped during manufacturing. The question isn't whether flaws exist. The question is whether they'll grow. And fracture mechanics gives you the tools to answer that question. The key concept is something called the stress intensity factor, usually written as K. It describes the stress field right at the tip of a crack, and it depends on three things: the applied stress on the structure, the size of the crack, and the geometry of the part. When the stress intensity factor reaches a critical value, called the fracture toughness of the material, written as KIC, the crack propagates. The material fails, and what fracture toughness really measures is the material's resistance to crack growth. A tough material has a high KIC. A brittle one has a low KIC. And for carbon steel, KIC drops dramatically below the transition temperature. This framework changed everything about how engineers design structures. Before fracture mechanics, the basic approach was, make sure the stress in the structure stays below the yield strength of the material. Add a safety factor, and you're fine. But the Liberty ship failures showed that wasn't enough. A structure could be well below its yield strength everywhere and still fail catastrophically if it had a crack in the wrong place, at the wrong temperature, under the wrong loading. Fracture mechanics added a whole new dimension to structural design. You had to think about flaw tolerance, about inspection intervals, about what size crack could be present without causing failure before the next inspection. And this thinking permeates modern engineering in ways you encounter every day without realizing it. When you fly on a commercial aircraft, the fuselage is designed using damage-tolerant principles that grew directly out of fracture mechanics. The structure is designed so that even if a crack forms, and cracks will form, from fatigue, from corrosion, from minor impacts, it will grow slowly enough that it will be detected during routine inspections before it reaches a critical size. There are crack-stopping features built into the structure, tear straps and stiffeners that serve the same function those rivet lines served in old ships. The inspection intervals are calculated based on crack growth rates and critical crack lengths. It's an entire philosophy of design that assumes imperfection and plans for it. And this philosophy connects back to something we talked about earlier, the idea that all strengthening mechanisms work by impeding dislocation motion, because fracture toughness and strength are often in tension with each other. If you make a steel stronger by adding more carbon, by creating more obstacles to dislocation motion, you often make it less tough. The dislocations can't move, which means the material can't deform plastically at a crack tip, which means cracks propagate more easily. It's a fundamental trade-off in material science, strength versus toughness. And managing that trade-off is one of the central challenges of alloy design, which brings us to something that was happening in parallel with all of this structural steel development, something that would eventually become one of the most important material stories of the 20th century. Because while metallurgists were figuring out how to make steel tougher and more reliable, a completely different class of materials was quietly emerging. Materials that weren't metals at all, that didn't have crystal structures or dislocations, that played by entirely different rules. And the first hints of this revolution came from a place you might not expect. A laboratory accident involving a pressure vessel, a refrigerant gas, and a chemist who noticed something strange at the bottom of a cylinder. It was April 6th, 1938, and the chemist's name was Roy Plunkett. He was 27 years old, working at DuPont's Jackson Laboratory in New Jersey, and he was not trying to invent anything revolutionary. He was just trying to make a better refrigerant. Plunkett had prepared about 100 pounds of tetrafluoroethylene gas, stored it in small steel cylinders, and chilled those cylinders with dry ice to keep the gas stable. One morning, he and his technician, Jack Reebok, hooked up one of those cylinders to their experimental apparatus, opened the valve, and nothing came out. No gas. The cylinder should have been full, but the valve was acting like it was empty. Now, a lot of people would have just tossed that cylinder aside and grabbed another one. Faulty valve. Probably. Move on. But Plunkett was curious. He weighed the cylinder, and here's the thing. It weighed what it should have weighed if the gas were still inside. So the gas hadn't leaked out. It was still in there, but it wasn't coming out as a gas. Something had happened inside that cylinder. So Plunkett did what any good scientist would do when faced with a mystery. He cut the cylinder open, and inside, he found a white, waxy, slippery solid coating the interior walls. The tetrafluoroethylene gas had polymerized. The molecules, under pressure and at low temperature, had linked together into long chains, forming a completely new substance, polytetrafluoroethylene, which we now call PTFE, or by its trade name, Teflon. And this is where we step into an entirely different world of materials science, because everything we've talked about so far, copper, bronze, iron, steel, cast iron, those are all crystalline materials. Their atoms are arranged in regular, repeating three-dimensional patterns. They have grain boundaries and dislocations and slip planes. All of the strengthening mechanisms we've discussed work because of that crystalline structure. But polymers like PTFE are fundamentally different. They're made of long molecular chains, sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of atoms long, tangled and coiled and folded over each other, like a bowl of incredibly fine spaghetti. Some regions of those chains might line up in an orderly way. We call those crystalline regions. But large portions are disordered, amorphous, just a jumbled mess of molecular strands. And this dual nature, part crystalline and part amorphous, gives polymers properties that would have seemed almost magical to a 19th century metallurgist. Think about what Plunkett found in that cylinder. PTFE turned out to have the lowest coefficient of friction of almost any solid material known. Almost nothing sticks to it. It's chemically inert. Acids, bases, solvents, they barely touch it. It can handle temperatures from near absolute zero up to about 260 degrees Celsius without degrading. And it's an excellent electrical insulator. During World War II, just a few years after Plunkett's discovery, PTFE found its first critical application in the Manhattan Project, where it was used to line valves and seals in uranium enrichment equipment because it was one of the few materials that could resist the incredibly corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas used in the gaseous diffusion process. That was its secret debut. The nonstick frying pan came much later, in the 1960s, and that's what most people think of when they hear the word Teflon. But its first real job was helping build the atomic bomb. Now, Plunkett's discovery was accidental, but the broader story of polymers was not. It was the result of decades of scientific argument and gradual understanding, and it's worth slowing down to appreciate just how confusing this class of materials was for a very long time. Because here's the thing about polymers. For the first few decades of their study, many chemists didn't even believe they existed. Not in the form we understand them today anyway. The key figure in this story is a German chemist named Hermann Staudinger. In the early 1920s, Staudinger proposed something radical: that materials like rubber, cellulose, and proteins were made of genuinely enormous molecules. Macromolecules, he called them, with molecular weights in the tens of thousands or even millions. Long chains of atoms covalently bonded together. This seems obvious to us now, but at the time, the dominant view among chemists was that these materials were actually collections of small molecules held together by some mysterious associative force, kind of clumped together like micelles in a soap solution. The idea was that no molecule could really be that big. It seemed absurd. Staudinger's colleagues thought he was, to put it politely, misguided. One prominent chemist reportedly told him that it was like claiming someone had seen a 1,400-foot-long cat. The molecules Staudinger was proposing were just too big to be real. But Staudinger was stubborn. He spent the 1920s and 1930s systematically building the case for macromolecules, using viscosity measurements and other techniques to show that these materials behaved exactly as you'd expect if they were made of very long chain molecules. And gradually, the evidence became overwhelming. By the mid-1930s, the macromolecular hypothesis was accepted, and Staudinger eventually won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1953 for this work. He was 72 by then. It had taken 3 decades for the scientific establishment to fully come around. And once chemists understood what polymers actually were, long chains of repeating molecular units, linked by covalent bonds, they could start designing them intentionally. This is the shift from discovering polymers accidentally to engineering them on purpose. And the person who arguably did more than anyone to bridge that gap was Wallace Carothers, another DuPont chemist who in the late 1920s and 1930s developed the theoretical framework for condensation polymerization and used it to create nylon, the first truly synthetic fiber. Carothers was brilliant, a Harvard-trained organic chemist who DuPont had hired specifically to do fundamental research. And he approached polymer chemistry with a rigor and intentionality that was new. He wasn't just mixing things together and seeing what happened. He understood the reaction mechanisms. He could predict what monomers would link together and how. And he used that understanding to design molecules with specific properties. Nylon was announced to the public in 1938, the same year Plunkett discovered Teflon, actually, which is a remarkable coincidence. And it was marketed as a replacement for silk in women's stockings. When nylon stockings went on sale in May 1940, 4 million pairs sold in 4 days. 4 million pairs. But then, World War II started, and nylon was diverted almost entirely to military use. Parachutes, tire cords, ropes, tents. And here's where the material science gets interesting, because nylon's properties come directly from its molecular structure in a way that beautifully illustrates how polymers work. Nylon is a polyamide. Its chains are linked by amide bonds, the same type of bond that connects amino acids in proteins. And those amide bonds can form hydrogen bonds between adjacent chains. Think of it like this. Each chain has little hooks along its length, and those hooks can grab onto hooks on neighboring chains. These interchain hydrogen bonds act almost like the metallic bonds in a crystal. They hold the structure together. They resist deformation. They give the material strength. And when you draw nylon into a fiber, when you pull it and stretch it, those tangled chains align in the direction of pulling. They straighten out, they pack together more tightly, and those hydrogen bonds between chains become more numerous and more effective. The material becomes stronger and stiffer in the direction you pulled it. This is called drawing, and it's conceptually similar to work hardening in metals, though the mechanism is completely different. In metals, you're creating more dislocations that tangle and impede each other. In polymers, you're aligning chains and increasing the density of intermolecular bonds. Different mechanism, same general principle. You're rearranging the internal structure to resist deformation. And this is one of those beautiful moments in materials science where you realize that even though metals and polymers are fundamentally different kinds of materials, the underlying logic of strengthening has deep parallels. You're always trying to make it harder for the material to change shape under load. In metals, that means impeding dislocation motion. In polymers, it means restricting chain mobility, either by aligning chains, by cross-linking them with covalent bonds between chains, by increasing crystallinity, or by introducing bulky side groups that make the chains stiffer and harder to move. Cross-linking is a particularly important concept, and you've encountered it even if you don't know the term. When Charles Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of natural rubber and sulfur on a hot stove in 1839, another laboratory accident, notice how many of these there are, he discovered vulcanization. What the sulfur does is form covalent bonds between the long polyisoprene chains in natural rubber, connecting them into a three-dimensional network. Before vulcanization, natural rubber was almost useless for engineering purposes. It got sticky and soft in hot weather, brittle and hard in cold weather. The chains could slide past each other too easily when warm, and they froze into a rigid glass when cold. But cross-linking with sulfur locked those chains into a network that could stretch and spring back, true elasticity, over a wide temperature range. The cross-links act like permanent anchor points. The chains between them can uncoil and extend when you stretch the rubber, but when you let go, the cross-links pull everything back to its original shape. More cross-links means stiffer, harder rubber. Fewer cross-links means softer, more flexible rubber. A pencil eraser has a moderate degree of cross-linking. A car tire has more. Hard rubber, like the old ebonite used in bowling balls and fountain pens, has a very high degree of cross-linking, so high that the material barely deforms at all. And this brings up something really important about polymers that makes them so different from metals and ceramics. Their properties are extraordinarily sensitive to temperature. There's a concept called the glass transition temperature, and it's one of those ideas that, once you understand it, explains so many everyday observations that you'll start seeing it everywhere. Below the glass transition temperature, the amorphous regions of a polymer are essentially frozen. The chains don't have enough thermal energy to move, to slide past each other, to rearrange. The material is hard, stiff, and brittle, glassy. Above the glass transition temperature, Those amorphous regions become rubbery and flexible. The chains can wiggle and shift. The material becomes softer, more ductile, more impact-resistant. Think about a plastic ruler on a cold winter day. If you try to bend it sharply, it might snap, brittle fracture, just like that cast iron in the D bridge, though for completely different microscopic reasons. But take that same ruler inside, warm it up to room temperature, and it bends without breaking. You've crossed above its glass transition temperature. Or think about why a rubber band left in the freezer becomes stiff and snaps if you stretch it. You've cooled it below its glass transition temperature. The chains are frozen in place, they can't uncoil, and the material fractures instead of stretching. Now, Wallace Carothers never got to see the full impact of his work. And this is one of those human stories in engineering history that's genuinely tragic. Carothers suffered from severe depression throughout his adult life. He carried a capsule of cyanide with him, reportedly as a kind of dark comfort. The knowledge that he had an exit if things became unbearable. On April 29, 1937, at the age of 41, he checked into a Philadelphia hotel room and took his own life, mixing the cyanide into a glass of lemon juice. Nylon, his greatest creation, wouldn't be publicly announced for another year. He never knew it would become one of the most commercially successful materials in history. Never knew it would change the textile industry forever. DuPont had been so focused on keeping the research secret that Carothers may not have fully grasped just how transformative his work was going to be. And yet the field he helped create, the deliberate, systematic design of synthetic polymers, exploded in the decades after his death. Polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, PVC, polyester, polycarbonate, epoxy resins, silicones. The mid-20th century saw an absolute flood of new polymers, each engineered for specific combinations of properties. And the key insight that made all of this possible was understanding the relationship between molecular structure and macroscopic behavior. The length of the chains, the degree of branching, the type of side groups, the ability to crystallize, the degree of cross-linking, the glass transition temperature, all of these molecular level features map onto the properties you can feel and measure: stiffness, strength, toughness, transparency, chemical resistance, thermal stability. Which brings us to something that was happening simultaneously in a completely different corner of materials science, something that would eventually converge with polymer chemistry in ways nobody anticipated. Because while organic chemists were figuring out how to build long-chain molecules from carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen, other researchers were asking a different question entirely. What happens when you take two very different materials and combine them into one? Not alloy them at the atomic level, like bronze or steel, but physically embed one material inside another, each keeping its own identity, working together as a team. And the answer to that question would lead to some of the most extraordinary materials human beings have ever created: composites. Now, the word composite just means something made of two or more distinct parts, and in that sense, composites are ancient, really ancient. If you've ever seen pictures of traditional mud bricks, the kind used in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, those were composites. You take mud, which is decent in compression but cracks easily when you pull on it, and you mix in straw, which is strong in tension. The mud holds everything together and gives the brick its shape, and the straw fibers bridge across any cracks that try to form, holding the brick together when it would otherwise fall apart. Two materials, each weak on its own in some way, combining to make something better than either one alone. That's the fundamental idea. And it's beautiful in its simplicity. But here's what makes modern composites so powerful and so different from a mud brick. It's the deliberate, engineered control of what goes where and why. In a modern composite, you typically have two components. There's the matrix, the continuous phase, the stuff that surrounds and binds everything together. And then there's the reinforcement, usually fibers or particles embedded inside the matrix. The matrix holds the reinforcement in place, transfers load to it, and protects it from the environment. The reinforcement provides the stiffness and strength. And the magic is that the composite, the finished product, has properties that neither material has alone. Think about it this way. Glass is stiff and strong, but it's brittle. It shatters. Polyester resin is tough and flexible, but it's not particularly stiff or strong on its own. But if you take thin glass fibers and embed them in polyester resin, you get fiberglass. And fiberglass is stiff, strong, light, tough, corrosion-resistant, and cheap. It's everywhere. Boat hulls, car body panels, bathtubs, wind turbine blades, those big water slides at amusement parks. It's one of the most commercially important materials of the 20th century, and it's fundamentally just glass and plastic working together. The reason this works, the reason fibers specifically are so effective as reinforcement, is one of the most interesting things in all of materials science. And it goes back to something we touched on earlier when we talked about fracture mechanics. Remember how cracks are the enemy? How a tiny flaw can concentrate stress and cause catastrophic failure? Well, here's the thing about bulk glass. A big piece of glass is riddled with microscopic surface flaws. Every scratch, every tiny nick, every little imperfection acts as a stress concentrator. When you pull on a glass rod, it doesn't fail because glass molecules are weak. They're actually incredibly strong. It fails because some surface flaw amplifies the stress locally until a crack shoots through the whole thing. The theoretical strength of glass, based on the strength of the silicon-oxygen bonds, is enormous, something like 10 gigapascals or more. But a real piece of window glass might break at 50 megapascals. That's a factor of 200 below its theoretical strength, all because of flaws. Now, what happens when you draw glass into very thin fibers? Two things. First, the process of drawing tends to heal or eliminate many of the surface flaws. And second, even if flaws exist, they're confined to individual fibers. A crack in one fiber can't jump to the next one because there's a layer of soft, flexible resin in between. Each fiber fails independently. So instead of one catastrophic crack destroying the whole piece, you get gradual, graceful failure. Fibers breaking one at a time. The matrix redistributing load to the surviving fibers. The composite is damage tolerant in a way that bulk glass never could be. This is the same principle, by the way, that makes a rope stronger than you'd expect. A rope isn't one continuous strand. It's hundreds or thousands of short fibers twisted together. Any individual fiber might have a weak spot, but the odds of all the weak spots lining up in the same place are tiny. The fibers share the load, and the rope is much more reliable than any single fiber. Composites work the same way, just in a rigid matrix instead of a twisted bundle. So, fiberglass was the first big commercial composite, really taking off in the 1940s and 50s. But the real revolution, the one that changed aerospace and high-performance engineering forever, came with carbon fiber. And the story of carbon fiber is a surprisingly tangled one, with multiple threads of development happening in different countries almost simultaneously. The earliest carbon fibers were made by Thomas Edison, of all people, back in the 1870s. He carbonized bamboo filaments for his incandescent light bulbs. But those were crude, weak, brittle, nothing like modern carbon fiber. The real development started in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In the United States, Roger Bacon at Union Carbide grew carbon whiskers in an arc furnace around 1958 and discovered they had extraordinary mechanical properties. Around the same time, researchers in Japan, particularly Akio Shindo at the Government Industrial Research Institute in Osaka, figured out how to make carbon fibers from polyacrylonitrile, which everyone just calls PAN. PAN is an acrylic polymer, basically the same family of molecules used to make acrylic sweaters. You take PAN fibers, heat them carefully in air to stabilize them, then heat them to very high temperatures, over 1,000 degrees Celsius, in an inert atmosphere. The heat drives off everything except carbon, and the carbon atoms rearrange themselves into graphite-like sheets aligned along the fiber axis. And this is where it gets really elegant. Graphite, as a bulk material, is soft. It's what's in your pencil lead. The carbon atoms are arranged in flat hexagonal sheets, and those sheets slide over each other easily. That's why graphite is a lubricant. But within each individual sheet, the carbon-carbon bonds are extraordinarily strong, some of the strongest bonds in nature. So if you can get those graphite sheets to line up along the length of a fiber, you get a fiber that is incredibly stiff and strong in the direction you care about, along its length. The weak sliding between sheets? That's mostly irrelevant because the sheets are all pointing the same way, parallel to the load. The numbers are remarkable. High-quality carbon fibers can have a tensile strength of 5 to 7 gigapascals and a stiffness, a Young's modulus, of 200 to even 900 gigapascals, depending on the processing. For comparison, steel has a modulus of about 200 gigapascals and a tensile strength of maybe 1 to 2 gigapascals. So the best carbon fibers are stiffer than steel and several times stronger. And here's the kicker. Carbon fiber is about 4.5 times less dense than steel. So on a strength per unit weight basis, which engineers call specific strength, carbon fiber composites absolutely demolish metals. It's not even close. But you can't just use carbon fibers by themselves. They're brittle. They're thin. Typically about 5 to 7 micrometers in diameter, roughly 1/10 the width of a human hair. You need a matrix to hold them together, transfer load between them, and give the material its shape. And this is where the polymer chemistry we were just talking about comes full circle. The most common matrices for high-performance carbon fiber composites are epoxy resins, thermosetting polymers that start as a liquid, soak into the fiber layers, and then cure into a hard, rigid solid through cross-linking. Remember cross-linking from Goodyear's vulcanization? Same concept, different chemistry. The epoxy molecules form a dense three-dimensional network that locks everything in place. The combination, carbon fibers in an epoxy matrix, gives you carbon fiber reinforced polymer, CFRP. And this material transformed aerospace. The story of how it got into aircraft is gradual and cautious because aerospace engineers are rightly conservative about new materials. You don't experiment with the wing of a passenger jet. So carbon fiber composites crept in slowly through the 1970s and 80s, first in military aircraft, then in secondary structures on commercial planes, fairings, control surfaces, tail sections. Each application built confidence. Each flight hour accumulated data. The real watershed moment for commercial aviation was the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which entered service in 2011. The 787's fuselage and wings are approximately 50% composite by weight, primarily carbon fiber reinforced polymer. That had never been done before at that scale for a commercial airliner. The Airbus A350, which followed shortly after, is similarly composite-intensive. And the reason airlines wanted these planes wasn't because composites are cool. It's because they're light. A lighter airframe means less fuel burned per passenger per mile. Over the lifetime of an aircraft, that translates to billions of dollars in fuel savings across a fleet. It also means the planes can fly farther on the same fuel load, opening up new direct routes that weren't economically viable before. But composites bring their own challenges, and this is important because it connects back to everything we've been talking about regarding failure and understanding materials deeply. In a metal, if you have damage, a dent, a crack starting to form, you can often see it. You can inspect the surface visually. Metals also tend to give you warning before they fail. A crack grows slowly through fatigue, and if you're inspecting regularly, you can catch it. That's the whole basis of damage-tolerant design that came out of the fracture mechanics revolution we discussed earlier. Composites are different. Damage in a composite can be internal and invisible. A composite panel can take an impact, say a dropped tool during maintenance or a piece of runway debris, and look perfectly fine on the outside while having extensive internal delamination. Delamination is when the layers separate from each other, and it can dramatically reduce the panel's ability to carry compressive loads. You can't see it. You need ultrasonic inspection or other non-destructive testing methods to find it. This means inspection protocols for composite aircraft are fundamentally different from those for aluminum aircraft, and the engineering community had to develop entirely new approaches to certification and maintenance. There's also the question of how composites behave in fire, how they respond to lightning strikes, which is a real concern for aircraft, since aluminum fuselages naturally conduct lightning around the plane, but carbon composites don't conduct as well, so you need embedded metallic meshes to handle that. And recycling composites at end of life is genuinely difficult. A thermoset epoxy matrix is cross-linked, remember? Those bonds are permanent. You can't just melt it down and reshape it like you can with aluminum. This is an active area of research right now, and it's one of the reasons there's growing interest in thermoplastic matrix composites, where the matrix can be remelted. But here's what I find most fascinating about composites, and it's something that ties together almost everything we've talked about on this whole journey through materials science. When you design with a composite, you're not just choosing a material, you're designing the material itself. At the same time, you're designing the structure. You choose the fiber type, the matrix type, the fiber volume fraction, the orientation of the fibers in each layer, the stacking sequence of the layers. You can make a panel that's stiff in one direction and flexible in another. You can tailor the properties to match the loads at every point in the structure. A wing skin might have fibers oriented primarily along the span to carry bending loads, with some fibers at 45 degrees to handle torsion, and some at 90 degrees for local pressurization loads. Every ply has a purpose. This is design freedom that metals simply cannot offer. A sheet of aluminum is isotropic, same properties in every direction. That's sometimes an advantage, but it also means you can't optimize. With composites, you can put strength and stiffness exactly where you need it and nowhere else. No wasted material, no wasted weight. And that philosophy of understanding the loads, understanding the material's response at every scale from molecular bonds to macroscopic behavior, and then tailoring everything to work together, that's really the culmination of everything materials science has been building toward for centuries, which makes you wonder about what comes next. Because if the 20th century was about discovering new materials, new alloys, new polymers, new composites, and learning to control their microstructure, Then the 21st century is increasingly about something even more ambitious. It's about designing materials from the atomic level up, using computational tools that would have seemed like science fiction even 30 years ago. And the people doing this work are standing on the shoulders of every single person we've talked about tonight. The ancient coppersmiths who noticed that hammering made metal harder, Bessemer with his wild converter, Constance Tipper with her careful fracture studies, Staudinger stubbornly insisting that polymers were real molecules, Carruthers methodically building nylon one reaction at a time. All of that accumulated understanding is now feeding into something genuinely new, a way of thinking about materials that doesn't start with what we happen to find in nature or stumble upon by accident, but starts instead with a question. What if we could specify the properties we want, and then work backward to figure out what arrangement of atoms would give us exactly that? This idea has a name. It's called computational materials design, or sometimes integrated computational materials engineering, ICME, if you like acronyms. And the basic premise is beautifully simple, even if the execution is staggeringly complex. Instead of making a material, testing it, tweaking the composition, making it again, testing it again, that old trial and error loop that has driven material science since the very first blacksmith, you build a computer model that predicts how a material will behave based on its atomic structure and composition. You simulate the physics. You let the math do the exploring instead of your hands. Now, this isn't entirely new as a concept. People have been doing computational chemistry and physics for decades, but what's changed in the 21st century is the scale at which it's become practical, and that's thanks to a convergence of things: faster processors, better algorithms, machine learning, and crucially, enormous databases of experimental results that earlier generations painstakingly gathered. All those careful measurements, all those tensile tests and fatigue curves and phase diagrams that researchers compiled over the last 150 years, that data is now fuel for algorithms that can spot patterns no human could ever see. Let me give you a concrete example, because this can sound abstract pretty quickly. Think about nickel-based superalloys. These are the materials that sit inside jet engines, in the hottest part, right behind the combustion chamber, where temperatures can reach over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The turbine blades spinning in there are experiencing temperatures that would soften most steels into uselessness, and they're simultaneously under enormous centrifugal stress because they're spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. The material has to be strong at temperatures where most metals would rather just quietly give up. For decades, developing these superalloys was an incredibly expensive process of trial and refinement. You'd adjust the nickel content, add some chromium for oxidation resistance, throw in some aluminum and titanium to form strengthening precipitates. Tiny ordered particles called gamma prime that sit inside the crystal lattice and block dislocation motion. Same basic principle we talked about hours ago with bronze, just at a much more sophisticated level. You might add rhenium, which is absurdly expensive, or ruthenium, which is even more so. Every new composition meant casting test bars, running creep tests that could take thousands of hours, analyzing the microstructure. A single new alloy might take a decade to develop and qualify for use in an engine. But now, researchers can model the thermodynamics of these alloy systems computationally. There's a method called CalPad. It stands for Calculation of Phase Diagrams, that uses databases of thermodynamic parameters to predict what phases will form in a given alloy at a given temperature. Instead of making 50 different compositions and heat treating each one and cutting them up and looking at them under a microscope, You can screen hundreds of compositions on a computer in an afternoon. You're not eliminating experiments entirely. You still need to validate the predictions. But you're narrowing the search space enormously. Instead of wandering through a vast landscape blindfolded, you've got a map. It's not a perfect map, but it shows you roughly where the interesting territory is. And this connects to something even more fundamental: density functional theory, or DFT. This is quantum mechanics applied to materials. You're solving the Schrödinger equation, or rather, clever approximations of it, for systems of hundreds or thousands of atoms, calculating the electronic structure from first principles. No experimental input needed, at least in theory. You're predicting bond strengths, elastic constants, defect energies, all from the fundamental physics of how electrons arrange themselves around nuclei. It's remarkable when you think about it. You're predicting how a material will behave based on nothing more than the atomic numbers of its constituent elements and the laws of quantum mechanics. The catch, of course, is that these calculations are computationally expensive. Even with modern supercomputers, you can't simulate a macroscopic piece of metal atom by atom. A cubic centimeter of iron contains something like 8 times 10 to the 22nd atoms. No computer on Earth can handle that. So you simulate small representative volumes, maybe a few hundred atoms, and then use clever mathematical frameworks to bridge from the atomic scale to the microstructural scale to the engineering scale. Each level feeds into the next. Atomic simulations tell you about bond strengths and defect behavior. Those feed into models of dislocation motion and grain boundary behavior. Those feed into models of how the microstructure evolves during processing. And those, finally, feed into predictions of macroscopic properties like yield strength, fatigue life, fracture toughness. This multi-scale modeling approach is one of the grand challenges of 21st century materials science, and it's still very much a work in progress. The gaps between scales are hard to bridge. Assumptions made at one level can compound into significant errors at the next. But the progress has been genuinely impressive, and it's accelerating. Here's where machine learning enters the picture, and this is where things get really interesting. Traditional computational methods, DFT, molecular dynamics, finite element analysis, are physics-based. They solve equations that describe how nature works. Machine learning takes a different approach. It looks at data, enormous amounts of data, and finds patterns. You train a neural network on thousands of known materials with known properties, and it learns correlations that might not be obvious from the physics alone. Then you can ask it to predict the properties of materials that have never been made. In 2011, the United States launched something called the Materials Genome Initiative. The name was deliberately chosen to echo the Human Genome Project, the idea being that just as mapping the human genome transformed biology, creating comprehensive databases and computational tools for materials could transform engineering. The goal was to cut the time from discovery of a new material to its deployment in a product by half. That's an ambitious target, but the philosophy behind it has spread globally. Similar initiatives exist in Europe, China, Japan. There are now open databases, like the Materials Project based at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, that contain computed properties for hundreds of thousands of inorganic compounds. Anyone can access them. A researcher in Lagos or Lahore has the same data at their fingertips as someone at MIT, and the discoveries are starting to come. In 2023, a team at Google DeepMind used a machine learning system called GenoME to predict the stability of over 2 million new inorganic crystal structures. structures that had never been synthesized. Of those, they identified around 380,000 as potentially stable, meaning they could in principle be made. Now, predicting stability is a long way from having a useful material. You still need to synthesize it, characterize it, figure out what it's actually good for. But the sheer scale of the exploration is something that would have been unimaginable even a decade ago. It would have taken conventional methods centuries to cover that much chemical space. Think about what that means for a moment. For most of human history, we discovered materials by accident or by slow, painstaking experimentation. The coppersmith who noticed work hardening, the unknown inventor who first added tin to copper, Goodyear spilling rubber and sulfur on a hot stove, Plunkett finding that weird, waxy white stuff in his gas cylinder. Even Carruthers, as systematic as he was still fundamentally doing bench chemistry one reaction at a time. Each discovery was a single point of light in an enormous dark room. Now we're starting to turn on the floodlights. But let me bring this back down to earth for a moment, because the most exciting applications of modern materials science aren't always the most exotic ones. Sometimes they're about making familiar materials work better in ways that affect millions of people. Take high-strength low-alloy steels, HSLA steels. These are the workhorses of modern construction and automotive engineering. They're not exotic. They don't contain rare elements. They're basically just steel with small, carefully controlled additions of elements like niobium, vanadium, and titanium, often less than 0.1%. But those tiny additions, combined with precisely controlled thermomechanical processing, that means carefully orchestrated sequences of rolling and cooling, produce microstructures with extremely fine grain sizes. And we talked about grain size way back at the beginning of tonight, how smaller grains mean more grain boundaries, and more grain boundaries mean more obstacles for dislocations. The Hall-Petch relationship. Same principle, just pushed to remarkable levels of refinement. Modern HSLA steels can have yield strengths 2 or 3 times higher than plain carbon steel. That means you can use thinner sections, which means lighter cars, which means better fuel efficiency, which means less carbon dioxide. It's not glamorous. Nobody writes breathless headlines about slightly optimized steel compositions. But the cumulative impact on energy consumption and emissions is enormous. Every kilogram saved in a car's body structure pays dividends over the entire life of that vehicle. And this is happening with aluminum alloys too. The latest aerospace aluminum lithium alloys are marvels of compositional optimization. Lithium is the lightest metallic element, and adding it to aluminum reduces density while increasing stiffness. A rare and valuable combination. But aluminum-lithium alloys are tricky. They can be anisotropic, meaning their properties vary with direction, and they can be susceptible to certain types of corrosion and cracking. Getting the composition and processing right required decades of work, and modern computational tools are now helping to push these alloys even further. Then there are the additive manufacturing materials designed specifically for 3D printing. This is a fascinating area because it turns some traditional materials science on its head. In conventional manufacturing, you start with a big piece of material and cut away what you don't need, or you pour molten metal into a mold. The material's microstructure is determined by how it was cast or wrought and then heat-treated. But in additive manufacturing, you're building a part layer by layer, melting tiny amounts of powder with a laser or electron beam. The cooling rates are extremely fast, sometimes 1,000,000 degrees per second. That produces microstructures that you simply cannot get through conventional processing. Extremely fine grains. Metastable phases that would normally require exotic quenching techniques. Supersaturated solid solutions that shouldn't exist according to the equilibrium phase diagram, but do exist because the material solidified too quickly for the atoms to rearrange themselves. It's a whole new playground for materials scientists, and it comes with whole new challenges. Parts made by additive manufacturing can have residual stresses, porosity, anisotropic microstructures, surface roughness issues. Understanding and controlling these requires all the fundamental knowledge we've been talking about tonight: diffusion, phase transformations, dislocation mechanics, fracture mechanics, applied in a completely new context. And then, on the horizon, there are materials that would have seemed like pure fantasy to earlier generations. Metamaterials, structures engineered at scales smaller than the wavelength of light, giving them optical or acoustic properties that no natural material possesses. Materials that bend light backward. Acoustic cloaking devices. These aren't really about the chemistry of the material itself, but about its architecture, its geometry at very small scales, its composites taken to an extreme. The idea that structure can matter as much as composition. Or consider self-healing materials. Polymers embedded with microcapsules of uncured resin, so that when a crack forms and ruptures a capsule, the resin flows into the crack and polymerizes, sealing it. The material literally repairs itself. It's not science fiction. Working prototypes exist. They're not yet practical for most applications, but the concept is being actively developed. Imagine a pipeline coating that heals its own scratches before corrosion can start. Imagine an aircraft skin that seals small fatigue cracks between inspections. The engineering challenges are significant, but the fundamental science is sound. And here's what strikes me about all of this, as we've wandered through thousands of years of material science tonight. Every single advance, every one, came from someone paying close attention to how materials actually behave, and then asking why. Why does hammered copper get harder? Why does tin make it stronger? Why does quenched steel become brittle? Why do ships crack in cold water? Why does a polymer stretch instead of snap? The questions haven't changed all that much. The tools for answering them have become unimaginably more powerful, but the fundamental curiosity is exactly the same curiosity that drove an anonymous metalworker 5,000 years ago to experiment with a new alloy. Materials science at its heart is the science of stuff. The stuff everything is made of. The phone on your nightstand, the glass in your window, the steel in the building's frame, the concrete in its foundation, the copper in its wiring, the polymers in its insulation, the silicon in every chip in every device you own. All of it was shaped by the principles we've talked about tonight, by atoms arranging themselves into crystals, by defects moving through lattices, by phases transforming, by cracks propagating or being stopped, by chains tangling and sliding and locking into place. And the beautiful thing is that it all connects. The same dislocation theory that explains why bending a paperclip back and forth makes it break also explains why jet engine turbine blades are grown as single crystals, to eliminate grain boundaries where cracks might start. The same fracture mechanics that Constance Tipper used to understand the Liberty ships now guides the inspection schedules of every commercial aircraft in the sky. The same understanding of cross-linking that Charles Goodyear stumbled into is used today to design advanced thermoset composites for spacecraft. It's one long, continuous story, and you've been listening to it while the world outside your window has gotten quieter. while the day has let go of you, while your breathing has slowed and your thoughts have softened. These ideas, atoms and dislocations and phase diagrams and polymers, they'll still be here tomorrow. The steel in your building will still be holding up the floors. The glass in your window will still be an amorphous solid, its atoms frozen in their disordered dance. The copper in your walls will still be carrying electrons from room to room. None of it needs your attention right now. It all just works, quietly, reliably, the way well-understood materials do. So let it work. Let the knowledge settle the way atoms settle into a crystal lattice, finding their lowest energy state, their most comfortable arrangement, everything in its place, everything at rest. The story of materials is patient. It's been unfolding for millennia, and it'll keep unfolding long after tonight. For now, though, this is a good place to let it go. A good place to stop wondering and just drift, carried by the quiet certainty that the world is made of remarkable stuff, and that understanding it, even a little, is one of the most satisfying things a curious mind can do.